Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by talking about stuff that's happening that you can't change. But then I want to come back and talk about freedom, which is the thing we really care about. And we really want freedom. I've never met somebody who doesn't want freedom, certainly not in this country. But we have to find freedom in the context of reality. And that's really what this presentation's about. Okay, growth is coming at you. This region, Brevard County, is growing more than 1% a year. That's very fast. And what that means is that change is coming. It means there's no such thing as the status quo. It means that if you say no to a proposal, it doesn't mean that things will stay the way they are. It just means that things will change differently. Now, when I first moved to my hometown, Portland, Oregon, I was in single digits. It was 1969, and it looked like this. There was lots of parking. We did not have a parking problem. Almost more than half of the center of our city was parking lots. And someone who was used to that might have said, you know, well, what's the problem? And the problem was that growth was going to come at us, and we didn't know what to do about it. And all we knew was how to do parking studies, and the parking studies would tell us we can't build another building downtown because we won't have anywhere to park, so we'll need to build them out on the edge of the city. The problem was that out on the edge of the city we had this, the best farmland in our state, right up against the city, ready to be paved over. In fact, what we have today is a world-class wine industry, a world-class set of vineyards on land we would have paved over. So in those days we had three choices. We already knew about economic stagnation. We'd done that. We could grow through sprawl, which is what in the 1970s everyone assumed you did. You grew horizontally because you needed parking, and you couldn't build anything close to anything else because there wouldn't be room for parking. Or we could really change how we did it, look to models of successful older cities that were built before the car, and we could do growth through redevelopment. We could build inside the existing urban form. And I'm here to tell you, having driven around some of your communities, I spent some time in Titusville yesterday driving around. There is space within your existing urban form. It is not built out. Well, what we did basically, in the 1972, we passed these very strong land use laws in Oregon that are still in place, which basically limit our ability to sprawl. And that's why we have a wine industry today. That's why I don't have to drive. It's not like Los Angeles where I would have to drive 2-3 hours to get to something that feels like nature. In Portland, it's like here. It's not very far. It's half an hour out. You're out of the city. You get to experience a wonderful agrarian landscape, a wonderful wilderness landscape close to the city, and that's intimately related to the fact that downtown looks like this. That we built very densely. We didn't worry about parking. We let there be not enough parking. We went ahead and built things close together, and we built the excellent transit system that would make it possible for lots of people to get into the center of our city, even though there wasn't much parking. And so now we have a different problem. Now, of course, we have succeeded in creating an incredibly desirable city that lots of people want to live in. So now we have a different problem, which is that we're choking on our prosperity. So we just had a mayoral election last year in which the entire election was about affordability and homelessness. They are the only things we talk about now. And that's because it's gotten very expensive to live in Portland, and the high cost of living in Portland is the free market telling you to build more Portland, telling us to build more of this thing that is in demand. And it doesn't have to look like Portland. It can look like other things. In Florida, it can look like West Palm Beach, which is probably one of the best examples of a fundamentally new city that's being built pretty much from scratch on very little in the way of a base into something quite substantial and dense. But that's what the market is going to look for. So here's the message from Portland. We are choking on prosperity. We are tired of prosperity. We would like you to take some of it away. But to do that, you'll have to have walkable cities and towns. So let's think about things that really matter to people and what it means to those things if you grow horizontally as opposed to growing more inward. What it means if you continue spreading your urban area out as opposed to starting to make better use of land inside your current built area. I don't need to tell you about recreational and flood control lands. The lands around you are not just beautiful, they're not just full of endangered species, they are your plumbing system, they are the stormwater system, they are the drainage system. Inward growth preserves them, horizontal growth destroys them. Energy, all of the things we care about energy and efficiency, about emissions, it's great we're going to have electric cars, but not if we drive them further. Electric cars need to not turn out like low-fat foods, right? Where low-fat foods made us eat more of them, so we ate the same amount of fat, right? That's always the danger. Even worse with driverless cars, which we'll talk about. Infrastructure costs. I hate to break it to you, but our infrastructure in this country, our road infrastructure, is unsustainable. I was listening to an interview on NPR the other day with an infrastructure, actually day before yesterday as I was driving around Titusville looking at this infrastructure. And he explained that during the mid-20th century, that when the first parts of the interstate system were being built, they were still experimenting with concrete and rebar, and they didn't know that what they were building at that time would have a design life of 50 years. And then it was going to need massive refurbishment and replacement. And all those bills are coming due. And if we continue to build infrastructure that is so inefficient, that is so much money to ultimately serve so few people because they're all in cars, we're never going to be able to maintain it. This is my friend Charles Marone at an organization called Strong Towns spends a lot of his time beating that particular drum about just the sheer sustainability of the infrastructure investment and the funding for its maintenance. If the word sustainable sounds geeky and abstract and West Coast for you, let me just make this simpler. The word unsustainable is a polite word meaning doomed. It means it will not continue. That's what unsustainable means. Economic resilience, the problem with an entirely car-dependent landscape is that if driving ceases to be cheap, if driving becomes expensive for whatever reason, it stops functioning. The beauty of that pre-war town, which people constantly tell pollsters they want to live in, that pre-war walkable town, is that it's able to prosper in many possible futures. And finally, of course, what's better at delivering freedom for everyone? And I'm going to argue that oops, I have this backwards, I'm sorry, that inward growth is ultimately going to give you the best freedom outcome. But let's stop and talk about what freedom is. The only coherent idea of freedom that I've encountered is that it is the ability to do what you want, but that it has two built-in exceptions to that. One is that you're not free to limit the freedom of others. You're not free to own slaves. You're not free to get in other people's way. You're not free to imprison other people. Other people have the same right of freedom that you have. In other words, we can't to talk about freedom is to talk about equality, isn't it? To talk about freedom is to talk about our obligation to one another to support one another's freedom. And then you're also not free to deny physical facts. Many people come to me with both of these expectations. Many people come to me feeling like I'm somehow challenging their freedom by pointing out that there are physical facts about reality, like this problem with infrastructure. And I want to know if this kind of freedom with these limitations is a freedom that's worth fighting for, because it's the only kind of freedom that makes society possible, and it's the only kind of freedom that's achievable. Because, and that brings us to this interesting idea that real freedom can only be an equal right. Our society is full of competition, which pulls us in the other direction from this, right? It's great that there are competitive forces in society, but ultimately my right to freedom is respected only because it's everyone else's right to, right? If we're not doing that, we're really engaged in dominion. We're really engaged in dominating one another, which is different from all of us being free. So the freedom to dominate is a contradiction in terms. Now, what's transportation? Transportation planning is planning for the physical element of freedom. What transportation planners do, what transportation investments do, is to secure our freedom to do anything that requires traveling faster than we can walk. So there are all kinds of freedoms that you can engage in on the internet now, right? At home in your pajamas. You can engage in freedom of expression. You can engage in freedom of speech. You can engage in certain kind of economic freedoms. You can run a business to a degree. But a whole lot of things still require leaving the house, because we've discovered over and over that we really need to be in the company of a lot of other people for a lot of other things to happen. And if that weren't true, everybody at Google and Facebook, where they have the best technology and people who know how to use it, they'd all be telecommuting, wouldn't they, if it were that easy? But no, Google and Facebook spend enormous amounts of money running enormous fleets of buses to bring people to their suburban office parks. And the reason they need to run those buses is because all those people want to live in San Francisco, the dense, walkable place, rather than the fairly unwalkable place where their business parks are. So we need to be in each other's company to do a lot of things. We seek out each other's company. We're social animals. The freedom to do that, in the Constitution's terms, the freedom of association, is fundamental. It's fundamental to work. It's fundamental to our social lives. It is what we go outside to do. And transportation is about that. So I want to talk about transportation planning, and when we talk about transportation planning, I want you to also hear the word freedom planning, because to the extent that we're talking about freedoms that require physical movement, that's what we're doing. So is freedom planning a contradiction? I have friends who are attracted by the word planning, and I have friends who are attracted by the word freedom, and they sometimes don't overlap. Planning may sound like one of those big government kinds of words, and a lot of people who are into freedom are not into very much government. But the contradiction is not between freedom and planning. The contradiction is between freedom and prediction. And I want to raise a question about prediction. What do I really want? I want to be free, but the thought of you all being free too can make me a little anxious. You know, we want to be free, but we want to predict other people's behavior. We want other people not to surprise us too much, right? And that's not really the deal, is it? I'm interested in talking then, and so when you pick up planning literature and you listen to planners talk, you'll hear a lot about predictions of human behavior, predictions of mode choice. If we build this, what will people do? And we need to predict what people will do to justify whether this is a good thing to build. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is that people being free to do what they want is a good in itself. Independent of our prediction about what they will do, it matters what they can do. That's what freedom actually is. And so when I'm talking about transportation networks, I've learned from experience to start talking about it this way. Let's not run to the prediction of what everybody will do in response to this. Let's pause over the fact that it'll just be great for people to be able to do more things. See what I mean? Very powerful idea. You know, in our business, when we get out to 20-year predictions too, and long-term transportation planning does this, we predict what traffic will be in 20 years, or we predict how many people want to use the transportation system in 20 years. And what are we doing? We're saying that we're going to predict how people are going to behave 20 years from now. What's our empirical basis for that? It's how people behave today. So young people in the room, understand what this means. It means we're assuming that when you're the same age that your parents are now, you will behave exactly the way they do. Because we're predicting your future behavior using your parents' behavior now, right? 20 years earlier. I don't actually want you necessarily to be exactly like your parents. In fact, I would like to live in a world where you are free to surprise us in the ways that cause change and improvement and in the society. And I like to plan for freedom because I like to plan for a world that will have new ideas and new surprises that are only possible if people can do what they want to do and not just what we predicted they would do. So that's kind of the core idea. So let's look at a picture of this. So in this sense that matters, there's a sense in which we're all in prison. And the walls of our prison are the limits of where we could go in a reasonable amount of time. So imagine somebody just saying, okay, where could I go in 45 minutes? And let's stop and think about what that question really is asking. That's not a nerdy question about transportation. That's a question about where could I work? Where could I study? Who could I date? Which might mean who will I marry? If you can't get to them, they're not available. They might as well be outside a wall that you can't get to. So this is about everything. Every kind of freedom, every kind of opportunity that arises in life, that matters to us in life, that requires going outside the door and moving faster than you can walk, is what transportation planning is about, or can be about. And I can draw a picture of this. We're working now on redesigning the bus network in Dublin, Ireland. And for that project, I had this sort of simple image. Imagine, that's a hypothetical woman named Jane. She happens to be plunked down at a particular point. She could be at any other point. Where can she, and we imagine her asking, where could I go in 45 minutes? Which is to say all those questions about the possibilities of her life. And I can say, okay, that's where she can go now. And under our revised plan for the network, that's where she will be able to go in 45 minutes. And that's 43% more jobs, 68% more homes. I can win a lot of arguments with this, especially when I make clear I'm not just talking about access to jobs as a social outcome. Yes, it is related to full employment, to less need for welfare, all those things, because we know that transportation is one of the primary things that keeps low-income people out of jobs. But it's more than that. It's everyone's ability to get to more stuff, do more things, have more choices. You hear the talk about food deserts, people who can't get to a grocery store. But beyond that, all the people who can get to only one grocery store. If you can only get to one grocery store, you don't have any choices, right? I want you to be able to get to multiple grocery stores. I want you to be able to get to multiple shops because I want you to have choices, right? That's what this is measuring. So it's not just jobs, it's all of those things. But now, where does that freedom come from? And here is where most people want to just fall into the assumption that freedom arises from a particular transportation technology. I know we have some folks from the car industry in the room. Which of these looks more like a car commercial, right? Probably the one on the left, right? The nice open road where you can drive all you want. I don't see a lot of car commercials that look like the image on the right, right? Okay, so it's easy to imagine that the car is an instrument of freedom, and if you live in a rural area or an outer suburban area, it is. But on the other hand, if you build a giant dense city on the assumption that cars are an instrument of freedom, they're not an instrument of freedom anymore, are they? That's not an image of freedom, the image on the right. That's an image of constraint. That's an image of people not being able to get places. So here's the thing, and here's what went wrong in Los Angeles. They built a city on the assumption that cars generate freedom, but cars only generate freedom until you build a city. Once you build density, you run out of space and you have congestion. This is a decision that your region could still make differently because you don't actually have terrible congestion yet. You can be more like Orlando if you want and have worse congestion. You can be like you can build car-oriented density, or you can build car-oriented density, and then you will have this because you have lots of people trying to travel in little space and having no choice other than cars. Or there are other ways you can build if you want to grow like we did in Portland. So does using a car maximize where I can get to? But remember that other limit on freedom. Does it do this without reducing where other people can get to? And no, in the image on the right, it doesn't. Those people are all in your way because you're in their way. And what you're doing is actually seizing something valuable from one another, which is a scarce commodity in cities called space. The definition of a city is lots of people in not much space. That means there's not much space per person, which means that the core problem of a city, unlike a low-density suburb, a core problem of a city is how to share space. And cars, for all their wonderful value as tools for freedom in suburban and rural life, do not share space very well. They take a lot of space per person. They take not just the area of the car and the area of the parking space, but they also take the dynamic envelope, the stopping distance. You've all learned about stopping distance. The faster you go, the more space you're taking, right? And a city doesn't have much space. So this is a famous image. You've probably all seen it. It goes around. This is 100 people in a city and how much space they take if they're in cars on the left, if they're on a bus in the middle image, if they're on bicycles in the right image. And the point of this is that as you grow a city, and we discovered this in Portland, as you grow a city, you create this problem, which is the need to use space efficiently. And there are two ways to use space efficiently when you have this problem. One is for people to ride in fewer vehicles with more people on that vehicle, which is what the bus is. The other is for people to move faster without taking up much more space than their body does, and that's what a bicycle is. Those are the two available solutions to the problem, things on the spectrum in between them. But that's the problem, is space. Now, is innovation changing all of this? Innovation, innovation, innovation. No, because technology does wonderful things, but it never changes geometry. And one of the things I'm always doing in my work is helping people notice when they are in the presence of geometric facts. Because once you understand that a fact is geometric, you stop arguing with it, and you stop expecting technology to save you, because technology never changes geometry. To be certain of the value of pi is to be certain of the value of pi in 2100. I get a group of brilliant young innovators in the room. I was at Southwest the other day, or last month. And I asked him, you guys can do anything. So tell me, is it possible that in the next century, some brilliant startup with a brilliant new invention will change the value of pi? Will change the ratio between the distance around a circle and the distance across a circle? No, there are things technology won't change. Technology also will not change that, because that is about sharing space, and the problem of sharing space is a geometry problem, not a technology problem. So technology never changes geometry. That's how much space people take if they're in a bus. That's how much space they take if they're in private cars. Now everyone gets into Uber and Lyft, and now it looks like this. And then we get driverless cars, and now it looks like this. And of course, the driverless car people are coming at me now and saying, oh, but they'll be a little closer together because they won't need as much stopping distance. Okay, that's fine. But there's a horrible problem called induced demand. And if there's one concept where I'd like to mind meld with the entire population and get one concept across, it's the concept of induced demand. It is why widening a freeway will not make traffic better. It is the problem that when you make something easier, people do it more. Like low-fat food, remember? It's low-fat so we can eat more of it. It's exactly how this works. I would like to have a cabin in the woods. I love the forests around where I live in Oregon. I'd love to have a little cabin out there where I could just go out and be by myself. And I could afford that. The reason I don't is that it would be really horrible to drive out there on Friday and drive back on Sunday. But if I didn't have to drive, I'd probably buy that cabin in the woods. And so would everybody else, and we would chop down the woods and just have cabins, and that is what suburban sprawl is, right? So this is why people are terrified of autonomous cars who think about urban planning, because of the possibility that it will unleash just enormous quantities of new driving, which will erase all the emissions benefits from electric vehicles, all of the safety benefits, everything, by making it possible for us to travel even longer distances. And that's why I think ultimately the solution is the driverless bus. I think if we get driverless cars, we will have to have the driverless bus. Nothing else will fit, especially as we build denser cities. So here's the best way I've found to think about, just to parse, to manage all the noise that's coming at us from the technology companies about this fantastic new future. And I want the future to be fantastic, and I want the future to be liberating. I'm very excited by driverless technology. I'm very excited by the safety benefits in particular. But we have to be clear that the people selling us technology, they're corporations. They want us to buy something, and what they want us to buy is an idea about the future. And so they want to talk about how all these things will fit together. But if you want to be a smart customer, you stop and think about how they work separately. And here's how it works. There are 4 different problems of urban transportation. There is a problem of communications, information when and where it's needed. We've had huge transformations in apps and information technology, which take a whole lot of friction out of the system that arose from people not having the information they needed at the moment they needed it. In my field, in bus transit, it's just enormous. 20 years ago, you had to walk out into the rain and stand in the rain because the bus might come at any time. Now you don't. You look at your app, you go out a minute before it comes. All kinds of things like that. There is a separate, unrelated problem of emissions and the efficient use of energy for which the solution is electric vehicles. That's about propulsion. There's a separate set of problems, the efficient use of labor and also, very importantly, safety, which is leading us to autonomous or self-driving vehicles. And there is a 4th problem in cities, which is the efficient use of space, for which the solution is, on the one hand, cycling, and on the other hand, people sharing big vehicles, which is what fixed route transit is. Often when I'm listening to tech marketing, I'm being told to confuse these things with each other and to imagine that the solution to one of these problems is a solution to one of the other problems, and it isn't. They are 4 different kinds of problems, and although they will fit together in wonderful ways and create wonderful things, we must not mistake the solution for one of these problems for the solution for another problem. And the issue of space, as we grow denser, will always be there. This is why transit and cycling are a win-win in a way that cars are not, right? The more people use cars, the worse cars work. The more people use cars, the more we get in each other's way and slow each other's down. The more people use transit, the better transit works. The same is true of cycling. The more people ride bicycles, the better cycling gets because cycling infrastructure gets better. So you have the basic problem that car dependence ultimately chokes itself off in a way that development around more diverse modes, particularly around transit and cycling, continues to build on itself. So I finally want to talk about one more thing, which is in many ways one of the most challenging things to think about with public transit. And it's something that I know is in the back of a lot of people's minds when they think about public transit in particular. And it's this idea that it needs to be right for me. And there's a particular danger we have out there. It's a phenomenon, I've coined the term for it, elite projection. Elite projection, which I encounter all the time among the relatively fortunate people, the relatively well-off people who tend to be on our boards and city councils and so on. It's the idea that a relatively fortunate person, it's what happens when a relatively fortunate person like that starts using their own tastes as a guideline for what would make a good service or a good city. So long ago, I was presenting a transit plan that I developed to the board of a transit agency in suburban Southern California. And one of the board members, who represented one of the wealthier cities in the area, leaned over and said, "Now, Mr. Walker, if we adopt this plan of yours, will that make me leave my BMW in the driveway?" To which the answer, of course, is no. If you have a BMW, and if your feelings about your BMW are such that you needed us all to know that right now, then I expect you to drive your BMW because clearly it's important to you. But you know what? You're a city councilman from the wealthiest city in the area. You are almost certainly in the top 5 percentile of wealth. That means there aren't very many of you, which means we shouldn't really care what you want. Because an actual business would be looking at quantity. Transit is not a luxury business. That's not how it succeeds. Transit is more like Walmart, and Walmart is an incredible success because they've been able to find that middle 80%. And I think of transit, when it really succeeds, as being aimed at that lower to middle 80%. We're never going to get the guy out of his BMW, but there aren't enough of that person to matter. The only challenge is that that person is especially likely to be a city councilor, a board member, someone in a powerful position. And we need to gently suggest to them that if they are in that position in society, their personal tastes are not necessarily going to be a good guide. Transit is full of extraordinary mistakes. Extraordinarily expensive mistakes have been made because of that mistake. Here's the other thing. It's very easy for people now, we're all in our own groups, we're in our own church, we're in our own group. There's those group of people on Facebook that seem to us to be the entire world because we've selected them based on the fact that they tell us what we want to hear, right? And neighborhood organizations and everyone else, we get together. I happen all the time when we get going on a transit plan for some area, the business community has come in, the Chamber of Commerce has come in and they've drawn the Chamber of Commerce bus network. And the schools district has come in and they've drawn the school district's bus network. And everyone's drawn their own favorite bus network that does just what they want. And in fact, a successful transit network for the whole city is going to need to mix all those people up on the same bus. Transit thrives on diversity, not specialization. But a lot of us want specialization. A lot of it need it to be just for us, and that's not how transit succeeds. So one of the most harmful ways I've found to think about this, which is still out there in the business, is this notion that the population, the users of a transit system, can be divided into something called a choice rider, who is the guy who has a car, and this person who has a car and likes driving their car, and we're supposed to get them to not use their car. And on the other hand, a dependent rider, somebody who has to use transit, implicitly has to use transit no matter how bad it is. And when certain transportation professionals get together in a room and they think nobody else is listening, they use an even worse word. They call these people captive riders. Captive riders like we have them in the dungeon, right? And in fact, what we know from actually doing transit planning and watching how people respond to it is that it is possible to make service so bad that you will lose almost all of these people. They too make choices. They may make choices in the context of a different set of situations, but they are making choices. And we have to care about their choices. And at the same time, there are very few people, the people where transit really succeeds is in the middle. And it succeeds from thinking about this as a spectrum rather than as a set of boxes. You know this issue about spectrum versus boxes, it goes fundamentally to how we think about income, isn't it? When I was a kid, people used a metaphor called the ladder of opportunity. Remember that metaphor? We don't hear it much anymore. The point of the ladder of opportunity was to help people see that this is a spectrum and that you can move along it, and that you can move along it one step at a time, right? And that we're all in the middle somewhere for the most part, and that it's workable. There's another way of talking about wealth, which is that it's boxes with walls in between them. That's what we mean by class, right? We have those metaphors that suggest that, you know, where you're born is where you'll end up, and there's nothing to do but be angry and resentful about that. Well, I'm always trying to keep the ladder visible because in practical terms, that's where transit systems succeed. They succeed in the middle. They succeed on the fact that when we improve a transit system a little bit, we get a payoff because we've moved a few people over the line to where it now makes sense to them to use it. And so the binarism, the need to distinguish between fortunate people and unfortunate people, the need to drive down the road, put it this way. I've had this experience many times and how you respond to this. You drive down the street in Orlando or something and you see people dressed for a factory job standing in a place where you wouldn't be willing to stand. Maybe it's really hot or maybe it's raining. And what do you feel about those people? Well, what I recommend feeling about those people is gratitude, because they are the early adopters. What they're doing is using a product before others will use it. They're using a product before it's good enough for everyone else to use it. That's exactly what early adopters do, right? Every inventor counts on those early adopters who will use the product before it is very good so that it gets better. So yes, early adopters. Another word is pioneers. Out in the West, we talk about pioneers where I live. We talk about people who came over the mountains on covered wagons precisely so that later we could have roads and airplanes. That person who did it when it was still difficult, in the early stages of developing something, when it was still frankly looked down on. Oh, go back and look at the biographies of pioneers. They were misfits and unwanted people back home for various reasons. They were looked down on in all kinds of ways. But just as they built the West, that low-income writer is helping us build the transit system. And when I see that person by the road, I'm grateful to them for that. So again, transit thrives on diversity, not specialization. So we have to be aware of the risk of elite projection. We have to be aware of the temptation to get into our group and design something just for ourselves. So finally, how to build a free city in my experience. Internal growth, not horizontal growth. Horizontal growth means everyone runs out into the distance looking for their freedom, and they all end up having to commute further and further and further. And finally, life just collapses out there. Identify your future transit corridors and activity centers. It's not too soon to do that in Brevard County. Identify those future corridors long before you can afford the service there. And in these places only, allow greater density and require less parking. Parking is the thing. Parking destroys cities ultimately because it makes everything too far apart. Prohibit high density away from these corridors. Push back against the notion that those urban people from Portland want us to all live in towers. No, we want there to be the option of living in a 2 or 3 story building or a small bungalow or a townhouse, but only in places where transit is going to be good, which means only in certain corridors where we're planning for that, not everywhere. And finally, of course, think about the fairness of how we fund roads as opposed to sustainable priorities. I learned in a meeting just before this that there's discussion of funding yet another east-west toll road between Orlando and the coast. I think you have a lot of east-west toll roads between Orlando and the coast myself, and that there are probably other things you could imagine spending that money on that would start to move you in a new direction. Thanks very much. Absolutely. I'm happy to take some questions, and I will rely on this man to tell us when it's time to wrap it up. I can just hand. Oh, you want to hand him?
Yeah, can you use that?
Sure.
Very much enjoyed your remarks. Is there some place or state or city that you would say, well, where we are now is a model for what we should be shooting for in the future?
I think you could certainly go to comparable places in California and see places that look very much, well, let me put it this way. I can think of many towns. When I drove around Titusville today, I was reminded of certain towns in California in 1970 or 1980. In other words, California has been where you are. Many of these very prosperous places have been where you are and have developed as they've developed from that, generally often by resisting sprawling. I can think of beach towns, in communities of your size in Oregon, where we have the land use laws that have sprawled a little bit, but where things are much more contained than they might have been in a sort of open environment. I have one other piece of advice on this line for the more idealistic among you who have been to Europe and who are thinking fundamentally about European ways of doing this that seem so much more effective. And that is, before you envy Europe, envy Canada. Don't envy them their weather necessarily, but go to Canada and notice, and of course this is more true in the northern part of the US than it is in Florida, but notice that we have up there cities of kind of similar age and similar history and a lot of similar kinds of economic history that look pretty familiar to us, but they have twice as much transit per capita. There's just more transit. And as a result, there's a more understanding of transit. It's an interesting example of just a place where Looks pretty familiar, but they're just a little further down the line with transit that way. So those are a couple suggestions. So this man has the microphone, so he'll be making the decisions about, wave at him rather than at me.
I wanted to say the gentleman asked for a city, Atlanta. Atlanta in the 70s was like this.
Right,
And then it started sprawl, but it also built its transits with the sprawl.
right. But the sprawl got way out beyond the transit is the only problem. That's what we've done in Portland. We've constrained, Portland looked the same way in the 70s. We've constrained the sprawl, and so the transit mostly gets to it. That's the difference from Atlanta, yeah.
Future solution, how do you think Elon Musk's idea of underground transportation?
Okay, again, most new inventions are, you've got to just go back to basic math and you can sort through these things, all right? Elon Musk did not invent tunneling. The idea of going into the third dimension. So we have this problem of sharing mostly two-dimensional space, right? The space of the city, the space of the surface. One way out of that problem is to go into the third dimension, elevated or underground. We've obviously tried both of those things in a lot of places. There are lots of old cities where we have to be underground, where there's no room for anything else. And it is so fantastically expensive to go underground especially. Figure about 10 times the cost of doing something on the surface, just to start. Elevated at least twice the cost. That it's not an easy solution, right? It's an expensive solution. You do it when you don't have any alternatives. And Elon Musk hasn't invented anything about that. He's invented the idea that we can make tunnels smaller so that fewer things fit through them and they'll be cheaper, but we knew that already.
Hello. Really appreciated the presentation and the human aspect of it, really putting the humans back at the center of the discussion and looking at how we can make things better on a daily basis as well. Now my question also relates to the third dimension, and it relates to the elevated sort of rendition of that. I guess I'm looking to see if you have thoughts about ideas out there of these taxis in the sky, whether they're quadcopters, flying cars, if you will, the Jetsons, something that we've been sort of thinking of and hearing about maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now could be a reality. Do you think that's a possibility for certain urban environments? And are there any specific characteristics to certain urban environments that would be, that would allow some openness to that kind of solution for urban transportation?
Think about the rates of traffic accidents we have now. Now imagine that happening over your house. Really. There are technologies out there that you might be able to pull off technologically that are just socially catastrophic. I mean, you cannot, the idealized world of the Jetsons, like so many idealized images of the world, the math doesn't work. You live at that density and there are a whole lot more flying cars than George Jetson ever had to deal with, and he is crashing into them, and that is so much worse than crashing into a car on the road, as if that isn't bad enough, right? The image of flying cars is two different things, right? It's cars, they're still taking a lot of space. You've gone into the third dimension, so there's a little more space between them, but they're also now moving in more different dimensions, and you've ended up with an even worse safety problem because now also there are the people under them, right? And you still haven't solved the ultimate spatial problem, which is that we have to use space visually, and we can't live in space. They all have to land, right? Remember Elon Musk's subway? This was the funny thing about Elon Musk's subway idea, which is that people are going to be able to take their cars into it, right? And the Boring Company, a few months ago before I had my interaction with them, the Boring Company had a website, had a video on their website that showed a luxury car, of course, coming into a parking space and then the parking space descending into the ground. That is how you know that something's being sold to elites, because you have to look at that and ask, okay, 5 p.m., what does it look like when 1,000 cars need to do this? How much of the city will we have to level in order to create the elevators to actually take 1,000 cars into the subway, right? It doesn't scale. Like so many things that are great for elites, it doesn't scale. And that's going to be the problem with flying cars, with everything else. One more comment about this. As you're hearing these technological pitches about how great it will be to ride in an autonomous car, notice the way these pitches resemble the original pitch for cars 100 years ago. And the way that many of the things that cars were going to give us in the way of freedom, they were going to give us that because not very many other people had them. And flying cars would be the same way. When it's just a few rich people, it's not a problem.
So you mentioned like autonomous buses, and you kind of seem a little bit for it, but also like a little bit against it in some aspects. When you talk about like math is like kind of the same, like you can't really change it. How are you expecting to like combat like in high densities and high loading densities, like canyon effects and GPS programming for those?
Well, two different kinds. Before we even get to technological problems like canyon effects, which we know about, and they're working on all those things about like what happens when an autonomous vehicle goes into a tunnel. You lose your satellite radio, but somehow that's supposed to keep working. All that stuff. That's technological. They can work on all that. What I meant about driverless buses is that we will need the driverless bus if we have the driverless car. I'm just not making a commitment about when we'll have the driverless car, because I like to predict things like pi rather than getting out there predicting things like technology. So I do think, so the other thing that's going on there, though, it's very important, is the math of labor, which is that the operating cost of transit is overwhelmingly labor. This, by the way, is why we can't turn big buses into small buses and have them be cheaper, because it's mostly labor. And labor cost is not really very reducible. Uber has tried. Uber has reduced their labor cost to the point that they have 90% turnover every year, which is a pretty good indication that you can't go much lower than that. So until we have automation, we're locked into the basic reality of labor cost, which requires us to use labor efficiently, which is the reason why a bus of some kind. But then why the driverless bus? If we have the driverless car, if we have a driverless taxi out there, that is suddenly much more abundant because it's driverless. I'm just hypothesizing that we not only have driverless technology, but it has also scaled to the point that it's abundant and cheap, right? We're not talking about Henry Ford's car, we're talking about the car about 40 years later when it's scaled to the point that everyone has one. Then we certainly have to have driverless buses as well, because transit too will need to be more abundant. And if the bus became driverless, there would suddenly be a whole lot more of them because the constraint is labor cost. That's the math. I'll try to be a bit briefer. I see a lot of questions.
I want to thank you for being here, Mr. Walker. Excellent presentation. I want to thank everybody in this room who clearly cares about transportation here in Brevard, because having grown over half a million people now, we desperately need, I believe, more mass transit and better mass transit. And specifically, I'd like to ask you what your thoughts are seeing those people that are sitting out, especially here in Florida, in the heat or in the rain, the relationship between the bus shelters, which we had very few of. I don't know if you noticed as you were driving around, very few bus shelters in our county, and the transit system.
And shelter is one of those early things you get into quickly, but you still start with the service, right? It's amazing what, because there are people out there who will use the service even without the shelter, and that's how you start. But then the shelter, then people see the people standing out there, and you start getting the consensus to do the shelter. It doesn't always happen in that order, but it usually does. Shelter is very challenging. You're not going to put one everywhere that someone's waiting, and that's the thing. But it is an important part of it down the line as you have a system and you're working on making it more civilized. Absolutely. Next one.
I had a cross question, I would say, in the sense of the speed of transit. And there's one marketing scheme that's being pressed today that is people who fly from up north, Atlanta usually, there's every place you can sail, and you have to go to Atlanta. And so they were premised to fly to Orlando, big hub, and then rather than wait for an hour and a half flying take a train
Okay.
over to Cocoa and then down the seaboard. And the majority of people tend to live near water. And so there's an existing freight line that runs down
Yeah.
the East Coast. And the idea was, well, we can get people to ride it if we just increase the speed, not really to the 120.
Let me come to let me catch the essence of your question. The essence of your question is that it is not about the speed of the vehicle, it is about the total travel time of the entire trip, right? When I showed you those maps of Dublin with those blobs that show the wall around her life essentially, has nothing to do with the speed of any vehicle. It is walk, wait, ride. So all those, and if you connect, then it's wait again, right? It's all those things. That's why frequently, and I'm not going to get into your intercity issues, but frequently at the scale of an urban transit network, we find that the most effective way to expand that blob is actually to improve frequency rather than speed. Because waiting time is actually a big part of it, and waiting time is of course multiplied if you're making a connection. So, and I know I'm dealing with someone who's outside that world when they start advertising to me the vehicular speed of a particular proposed service as though that says anything about the total trip time. Because the total trip time is about frequency and those other things, absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much for providing analysis to us. I was vice chair of the Brevard Transit Authority in 1980 to 1984. 34 years ago.
Right.
We were dealing with this 34 years ago. Okay? There has been very little progress in Brevard County, and there will be very little progress in Brevard County if we have people just talking about technology. The problem is not that. The problem is our political structure and the fact that retirees move here and demand that they have no tax, no way to pay for anything. Okay? The most practical thing that's being planned is a railroad from Miami to Orlando. Everybody is against it. Why? Because they might have to wait at a crossing gate for 5 years. Your presentation would be much better for us if you were to tell us how to get the attention of politicians and how to get financing. That is what we need. For 34 years, we've been thinking about what you're presenting, and it hasn't worked.
And I would just say, some of these problems, the politics come along where there's enough urgency. And it's inevitable that some of us can predict the urgency more than other people can, right? And you can say that about climate change, you can say about a lot of other things. There have been people who saw this as urgent a while ago, and there are people who are still figuring it out. I think that when you look at what it's going to take for you to be competitive as a good place to live now, in the context of what the market is now, particularly if you choose to be anything other than a retirement destination, which means you need to be sensitive to the tastes of younger people, then you're going to find that you have to do this. And you're going to find that, and I can't promise when the political consensus will arrive, but it gets there. There was just this interesting competition for the Amazon headquarters, which made a whole bunch of cities discover, wait a minute, no, Atlanta has no hopes of this. It does not have enough of a transit system beyond the very core. And so that is turning. And it is different generationally, and it is different historically now than it was 30 years ago. And I think more of us, too, can see a whole bunch of different kinds of unsustainability bearing down and wanting to do something about it. I am not saying it's easy. People in liberal California hate taxes, too. But we get the 60 or 70% votes for them because enough people don't see an alternative. And you'll get there.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Walker. I'm a graduate student here. I'm now doing a project about the impact of autonomous vehicle to public transportation.
The impact of what? Autonomous?
Yeah,
Autonomous vehicle
to public transportation. I want to ask, do you think the autonomous vehicle can kind of limitation to freedom
Say that question again. Can
Yeah, the autonomous vehicle can be kind of limitation to freedom.
The autonomy of the vehicle has nothing to do with the spatial problem, and it is in space that we get in each other's way and reduce each other's freedom. So no, you remember I showed you those 4 problems. It's a different issue than the spatial issue, and it is in physical space that we get in each other's way. That's why, great if you have autonomous cars, we'll need to have autonomous buses, everything can be autonomous, we can work with that. But it's a different question, it's a different problem. Yeah. So this gentleman's controlling the mic back here, so wave at him rather than me.
Go on stream. We are right in the middle of a college campus, and
Right.
I love going from city to city and seeing college campuses because they're pedestrian campuses.
Exactly.
And I came down Wickham today. I'm from Orlando. Came down Wickham, and all I saw were new restaurants, new buildings going in all the way along, all those new curb cuts. And I felt if we could only build this type of pedestrian or begin to look at things in an area or a district as opposed to going lot to lot to lot.
Right.
I think that's the upstream that's going to have to be necessary to build the densities you were referring to.
And that's what people want, actually. You know, very few people, you know, when they do pollsters, they, you know, the new urbanists, you know, do these polls about, you know, describe the ideal community. And people don't describe subdivisions; they describe small towns. They describe walkable small towns, and you know, it's just the necessities of the car, which has pushed everything so far apart, that has prevented people from getting, you know, what they actually want. So I think you're absolutely right. And you know, when transit-oriented development was rebranded as traditional neighborhood development, way of keying into that. That's right.
I am a retiree who will pay the taxes. That's not the point for me. My point is, as I grow older, and I'm getting there, I'm scared to death to live in this environment because what happens if I can't drive?
Right. What happens if you can't drive is that you become dependent on services that are very expensive for the government to provide. It's called paratransit. It has an incredibly high cost per rider, and as a result, it's very, very hard to make it more than bare bones. And yeah, that's the reality of this landscape. That's right.
You know, one of the items that you mentioned was, at my end, was cost. Cost is significant in this whole discussion, and you haven't really emphasized it enough. At what point does it become uneconomical to drive a car? Is probably a better question. And that's going to be the trip point, I believe, where we're going to driverless cars, where you rent them instead of, and then the private car will gradually disappear. That's what I would like to see happen.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
And the other thing is, in many cities in Europe, they allow free transportation for people over 65.
Mhm.
A good example of that was one I went to about 2 or 3 years ago. It was Prague. It didn't matter whether you were a citizen.
Right.
As long as you were over 65, you could prove it. You could travel on the subways, you could travel on the buses, you could travel on the trams for nothing.
So the point about cost, just to bring it back to that, is that every time I've used the word scale, I've been talking about cost. I'm ultimately talking about, you know, is this, whatever this is, going to get a price down to the point that it will really scale and lots of people will be able to use it. That's true of a lot of things. And I think that fundamentally what you can do from the standpoint of a local community and the things that a local community can control are to start with the reality that all kinds of changes in the larger cost structure of transportation are coming at us. They're coming at us from lots of different points of view. We can't really predict them all. Prices of fuel are going to go up and down. Maybe electric vehicles are going to come in and scale and deliver us from that, but we're not sure when, right? We don't really know when autonomous vehicles are coming on, and then sometime long after that, they become affordable, right? And then you're right, the whole question about whether their fleets are owned and how that gets manipulated and what government policy is, all you can do is plan for resilience, right? You start with planning for a community that can prosper in many different possible futures, under many different sets of circumstances, right? The technical word for that is resilience. And that ultimately is the only basis for responsible planning that makes sure that whatever happens, your community will be okay, right?
The other thing is congestion pricing for cars.
So sure.
insurance.
So we're ultimately going to get to a point where the massive subsidies going into encouraging driving are going to have to change. And it will take the form of some sort of price for using the roads. A price that cars will pay and higher occupancy vehicles won't pay. The Orlando toll roads are just, a little bit of a step in that direction in terms of what the infrastructure might look like. Once you have those easy pass systems, you can start to play with them as California does, for example. But ultimately, you have to remember that transit looks expensive because we make the cost visible. Driving looks cheap because we hide the cost. Not only do we have a whole different sense for what is the tripwire for needing yet another tollway between Orlando and the coast, but everything we do contains in it the cost of car transportation. The free parking at the grocery store. If I take the bus to the grocery store, the cost of my lettuce includes the cost of the parking I'm not using. That is ultimately what road pricing is confronting. You can immediately see why it's difficult, because people who have an entitlement to more than their fair share, quite frankly, that's what you're claiming, more than your fair share, are going to feel defensive about that. But I'm confident we'll get there because nothing else is sustainable, and unsustainable means doomed. And when we get to the point of enough people recognize that, we will do what it takes. We always do. Winston Churchill's great line about the Americans, they'll do the right thing once they've tried everything else.
We have time for 2 more.
Okay, it's up to you.
Thank you. Would it be good, to replace the buses with the trams
Generally not.
for the environment?
Right. No, not for the environment. For the environment, it's better to have electric propulsion than diesel propulsion. But remember, that's a different issue. Remember those 4 problems? Propulsion's a separate problem. And yes, electric propulsion is better for the environment than diesel propulsion. But that's a different question from whether you want to be trapped on a set of rails and not able to maneuver. So light rail, where it's built properly, like they're doing it in Seattle, where it never interacts with traffic, where it has a clear running way the whole way, that you can put on rails. There's a very bad idea around in the US called the streetcar, where the idea is we build rails in traffic, we run streetcars, we run these rail vehicles in traffic. We have one in Portland, you're welcome to come see it. It was designed primarily to sell real estate. We have the joke in Portland that it's easy to photograph the streetcar in front of the development you're trying to sell because it usually isn't moving. So rail has a big disadvantage, which is you're trapped on it. It has another big disadvantage. You get to the end of the rails, everybody has to get off. You can hear I'm a big proponent of bus rapid transit. You hear I'm a proponent of the flexible vehicles that fit on our roads, that work with what our roads are, but that are expedited where they need to be to get past traffic.
I have a simple question in relation to the University itself. How do universities contribute to the transportation problem and possibly solution?
Pretty simple. If you're offering free parking, you're part of the problem. Not to be too blunt about it. You can make life a lot better for undergraduates. You can make your university more inclusive of people coming from different economic backgrounds if it is easy to live here without a car. And that means, and as somebody who went to college long ago in a place with no transit, Claremont, California, 40 miles east of Los Angeles, I can tell you that was a huge limitation, being a relatively poor student at a campus where most students had cars because they could afford them and I couldn't. And there was no transit system to speak of. And that was a poorer experience. For example, I didn't get to experience Los Angeles. I was 40 miles from the city and it might as well have been on another planet. a good local transit system can be a liberating feature that dramatically improves the quality of life of the university. Imagine if you can go to the beach on your own instead of having to find a friend to take you with a car to take you to the beach, right? Those kinds of things that make a big difference to your life here. Universities are powerful engines of transit ridership where they're given good transit service. In fact, there are university cities, generally larger universities in smaller cities, where the university actually runs the whole city's transit system. Davis, California, is a good example. And there are many more where the university has supported getting the city's transit system up to a level where it's useful to students, and then making the transit system free for its students, which is a financial deal between the university and the transit system. I believe Space Coast Area Transit has that with the community colleges here, but not with FIT. But ultimately, what will make this a crisis is that FIT will want to expand its academic offerings, and it will need to build on the parking lots. And generally, that is the moment in the history of a university when transit suddenly becomes much more important, because there are ultimately better uses for this land than parking. And so I would say universities are, by their nature, excellent laboratories. You can try things in universities. You can do things that the society as a whole isn't ready for. And you have a wonderful resource in the nature of the student market, and especially the undergraduate market. You have lots of people who are perhaps temporarily poor, most of them who don't have huge incomes right at the moment they're going to school, and which means they're ready to be the early adopters, right? They're ready to be the early adopters of something if it's basically useful. And so some of the best small city transit systems we have in this country, go to Davis, California, are fundamentally driven by the university, but the university working closely with the city to create something that works with them both.